Hello, hello, hello. Cat ears are sideways. Hi, everyone. How's it going? Oh, hi. Yeah, we're going to be listening to a podcast. My teacher did not assign me a video this week, but we have a listen to podcast. So feel free to do whatever you need to do while we listen to this. I just need to get it together. Cool. So, there we go. Is that working? I think that works. There we go. All right. So this podcast, I'm going to shrink it a little. Let's put it, that's fine. Okay, so this is the Ezra Klein show. I have never heard of Ezra Klein before, but what has been assigned to us this week is, can we change our sexual desires? Should we? And there is a transcript that I could put up on the screen if people want that. And she only assigned half of this, half the podcast, so we're not listening to the whole thing. And welcome, whoever has joined. We are live on YouTube and Twitch. Oh, yes, I do have kitties. I do. They're behind me. Let me see. My room is very messy. There's Kitty 1. And there's Mr. Percival back there, sleeping on his pee mat. It's clean, by the way, but for some reason, the cats love sitting on it, laying on it. I don't know. But Mr. Percival's back there. And I guess we get a little tiny Scout in the corner. They've been cuddle bugs today. All right. I hope everyone's doing well today. Oh, yeah. I just use like the little brush thing. His hair is long, so I have to like swirl it around and get the brush to like really grab it off of the carpet of the cat tree. Let's see, maybe I should just put the transcript up. Is that showing? Yes, it is. All right, here we go.
The title does it justice. It's not really about a right to sex. It's about maybe a right to desire. It's about whether or not we should interrogate the meaning and construction of our desires. And in particular, it's about what it means if the world says, for whatever reason, that we are not desirable. Do we have the right to be desired? Do we owe each other desire? Do we need to take the cost of being undesired seriously? Can we change our desires in ways that make them more just or more free? And putting Elliot Rogers aside, because, of course, as Srinivasan says, there are very good reasons he was not a desirable person. Putting him aside, what about all the people who aren't desired for unfair reasons, for reasons of social pressure or even oppression? Srinivasan's new book of essays, The Right to Sex, includes that essay alongside other pieces about consent and pornography and student-professor relationships and sex work. The book's been causing a splash. It's being published in the UK, and it's going to publish in the US on September 24th.
A what? A firm what? I gotta see that again. Firminator to remove it? I have never heard of that. Okay. Okay, as long as the podcast is, just let me know. I'm gonna do a little test again.
First.
Okay.
And these essays all ask a
Can
pretty
you hear me?
fundamental question.
Can you hear me?
Where do our
over top of
desires and
this?
beliefs about sex come from?
Is this an okay
How much are they
level?
ours and how much are they given to us? And if they're given to us, who gives them to us and how? If they're not shaped well, can they be reshaped? Is that a proper
should be
question
good
for
now.
politics, or is desire something to be left to individuals? One note before we get started. This conversation was recorded before the Supreme Court on September 1st permitted a Texas law prohibiting abortions after 6 weeks. My intention is to cover that in a future episode, but if it seems like a weird omission from this one, that's because it had not happened yet when we recorded this. As always, my email, if you have guest suggestions, feedback, thoughts, reflections, EzraKleinShow@nytimes.com. Amia Srinivasan, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I do have the link of the podcast from the New York Times, what I'm looking at right now, in the description, but I'm also going to put it in the chat in case you want to bring it up and look at the transcript yourself. Or, listen to the whole thing on your own later as well.
Thank you so much.
Tell me about a distinction you make early in the book between sex that is free and sex that seems free because it is ubiquitous.
So this is a distinction that feminists, especially in the late 1960s and 1970s, started drawing in response to widespread dissatisfaction at the supposed sexual revolution that was supposed to set everyone sexually free. And of course, the sexual revolution did set people free in some deeply important senses. So the ability to have non-procreative sex, forms of non-normative sex, increasingly tolerated, if not approved of, sex outside of marriage, sex outside of monogamous relationships. But nonetheless, the women of both the US and the British women's liberation movement of the late 1960s and 1970s felt like, in an important sense, they were still having sex on men's terms. And in fact, sexual freedom had become synonymous with having lots of sex with lots of different partners, getting over your prudish hangups about having sex. And it wasn't really about thinking creatively about the role that sex and desire and sexual hierarchy plays in human and social and political life. That sort of sense of dissatisfaction, I think, prompts us to ask what a kind of freer sex might look like. And I don't know what a maximally free sex looks like, but I think we have some senses of what it doesn't look like. So it's not a sex that operates as a kind of commodity that people hoard, or a kind of luxury status good that people hoard in order to climb a sort of perceived sexual hierarchy. It's going to be a sex that isn't inflected by things like racism and classism and ableism.
I want to go back to something you said a minute ago, which is this idea that you can hoard sex as a luxury good. Tell me what that means. Tell me how you would do that.
Like not have sex? Hoard it? Or are you collecting sex partners? I'm confused. Okay.
I mean, you obviously can't literally do that because sex isn't a commodity. It doesn't have, obviously, sex is something that involves material reality, but it's not like something you can literally store in your basement, right? Sex is an activity. It's something that we do with other people or with ourselves. But nonetheless, there's a quite commonplace, if implicit, understanding of sex as a thing that confers status. And that's not just sex with anyone. Sex with certain high status people, with certain high status bodies, confers high sexual status on you. Of course, how much sex you should be having and with whom you should be having sex depends on how you're gendered. So men's status on the whole in general goes up the more sex they have, but that's not true of women because women are in some sense the sexual commodity. And of course, this stuff plays out in kind of complex ways when you're thinking about queer sexuality, which sometimes replicates those same kind of norms. And different bodies and different people are going to be seen as accruing to you different amounts of sexual status. And of course, I'm using this idea of sex as a shorthand because it's actually not sex itself that confers status. It's the ability to have free sex with the person, right? So having coerced sex with someone doesn't confer status on you generally, but also paying for sex isn't really understood to confer status, right? Because in a way, it's the wrong set of motivations, right? So the person is having sex with you for the wrong reasons. You want them to have sex with you because you yourself are high up in a sexual hierarchy.
It always strikes me, and it strikes me in your book, that it isn't having sex with people that confers status. It is being desired by them. You talk a lot about incels, young men who are often, though not always, angrily celibate. And one of the things that you point out is that they want to have sex with what they call Stacies, not just anybody, but beautiful, thin, high status women. And if you had secret sex with a Stacy, it wouldn't do all that much for you socially. Or if you had paid sex with one, it wouldn't do all that much for you either. What a lot of the debate about sex is about the value of being desired, the value of being seen as having high social status. All lines get attributed to Oscar Wilde, and this one does too, but there's this old line, right? Everything is about sex except sex. Sex is about power. And I think it's more precisely about status. But I'm curious how you think about that, because we keep using the term sex, but it seems this really operates through the medium of desire and public desire.
To take the example of the incel, the complaint comes in the form of not getting sex, not having access to sex, but it's not really about that. So very few incels are interested in being what they call escort cells, incels who pay for sex, because what they're angry about is not lack of access to women's bodies per se, but lack of, as it were, like free access, right? They don't want it to be a monetary exchange. What they want to be doing is exchanging their high status, which they think they're unfairly deprived of, for sexual engagement. Women who self-identify as involuntary celibates, who call themselves femcels, I mean, they often accuse male incels of hypocrisy. So they say, look, these are guys who claim that they're just lonely and no one's interested in them, but they're completely uninterested themselves in romantic or sexual relationships with like shy women or socially awkward women or women who don't conform to normative standards of hotness. So the game is entirely about status. So we can use sex as a kind of shorthand, but sometimes things go very wrong when we use it as a shorthand. So I'm thinking of people who think that somehow the solution to the so-called problem of incels is to redistribute sex. I mean, that's just a kind of...
Robin Hanson, the economist, famously made this comment.
Exactly. And I think that's just to kind of misunderstand what's really going on. It's not about sex as such. It's about a hierarchy of sexual desire.
This does not compute with my brain. Like, this is a bit too complex in terms of how I personally view sex and sexual desires. So it's slightly weird.
Desirability. It's about sexual status.
And in the title,
I don't quite understand like what they're talking about with the sexual status. They're talking about like, really hot, sexy, beautiful, conventionally attractive women versus like not.
essay of your book, The Right to Sex, this is what you're discussing, jumping off from the incel case, but to the question of how are our desires formed? And what does it mean to not be desired? Because the culture says you are not somebody who is as desirable. Can we say desire is political? Can we say it is problematic? Can it be changed? So I want to explore that. And let's start here. How do you understand the process by which our desires are formed?
So I want to offer nothing like a complete theory of the formation of desire. And I think you've got to leave that to a combination of the psychoanalysts and the historians and the sociologists. But I think one thing that's quite obviously true, although it's an ugly thing to acknowledge, is that some of what's itself quite ugly about our politics does shape this question of desirability and where people fall on a sexual hierarchy. And so I think that's clearest in the case of racism, and dating apps didn't in any way create the problem.
Wait, I need to back that up. Sorry.
Historians and the thing.
So I want to explore that.
Theory of the formation of desire. And I think you've got to leave that to a combination of the psychoanalysts and the historians and the sociologists. But I think one thing that's quite obviously true, although it's an ugly thing to acknowledge, is that some of what's itself quite ugly about our politics does shape this question of desirability and where people fall on a sexual hierarchy. And so I think that's clearest in the case of racism, and dating apps didn't in any way create the problem, but they give us a nice quantifiable insight into the problem. And so you can see the way in which, for example, East Asian and South Asian gay men are very often kind of what I would call sexually discriminated against on an app like Grindr. Black women, a similar thing happens on straight dating apps. They're just sort of seen as less sexually desirable. And sometimes what you'll have are people, this is more common on Grindr than it is on straight dating apps, I think, because straight dating apps, it's sort of important for the economy of those apps to have this kind of pretense, at least, of like romance. But gay men are pretty forthright about what they want and what they don't want. So you get a lot of, in addition to saying like, I don't want a smoker, it's also like, or like, I want someone who's a bottom. You also say, I don't want any Asian guys or any Arab guys. So that's not supposed to be a complete account of where desire comes from. I think desire is a lot more complicated than that. I don't think it's wholly determined by our politics, but I think it's pretty clear that political forces shape at least hierarchies of desirability, which then I think interact in kind of complicated ways with whom we actually do desire.
I want to ask about
Disabled
what
people
it
too.
means to be
The other thing that I hear a lot is like, no, disabled people usually get shoved to the bottom of the barrel, especially if they have physical disabilities, like visual disabilities. And honestly, for a lot of people, they don't even want to deal with people who have invisible disabilities because it can be very difficult, especially money-wise, depending on the disability. But yeah, let me show you a thing that my friend posted. This says if you have no job, no car, no place that's yours, or a roommate on disability, a girlfriend looking for sex only, please hit the X. I'm an adult that wants an adult. So they are, and they also say they're a thick, curvy gal. It's like whatever. But this part right here, the disability, how does having a disability and being on disability mean you're not an adult? Like what? Or like when people really care about height, like some of these things just make no sense to me. No sense.
Fairly undesired. And when we would apply that condition. So you've used the example here of racism. And I think most of us would say that, yes, racism, socially imposed racism, is an unfair way in which people are devalued sexually and in many, many other facets of their lives. But other ideas come into here too. Tall people, particularly tall men, are much more sexually desired
Yep.
than shorter men. And they make more money. They have all kinds of better life outcomes. There are all kinds of issues simply around attractiveness. There are
not fair.
issues of you are smarter, you're more articulate, able-bodied. When
Yep,
is
disability
something
right there.
a desire hierarchy that we can say is problematic because it's political? And when do we throw up our hands and say, we're human beings, there's a lottery in this, there is luck and unfairness, desire is hard to discipline, and we just have to leave that alone? Maybe we lament it, but it is not within the venue of politics.
So, what's so useful about the case of racism is that we have an independent grasp on racial domination as an oppressive structure. So we can recognize that there is an important link between, say, the racialized nature of policing in the US or healthcare or education and the racial discrimination that lots of women of color experience on dating apps or at predominantly white schools or in predominantly white institutions. It becomes much harder in the case when we're thinking about something like beauty, right? The beauty lottery. I mean, we call it the beauty lottery. It's complicated, of course, because beauty norms and attractiveness norms are hugely historically and culturally contingent and sensitive. So part of the luck here is not just like a genetic lottery and a lottery of wealth, because of course wealthy people have access to things like dental care and good nutrition, but also the luck of like being born in the right time and place for your phenotype. I mean, there's sort of two different ways of envisioning a kind of project of critical interrogation of desire and hierarchies of desirability. So one way of thinking about that project is as a matter of disciplining our desires under the force of politics. So we think to ourselves, like, does my pattern of desire match up with the political commitments I avow? There's a different kind of question, which is, to what extent am I really in touch with what I desire? And to what extent am I really just interpreting my relations to other people through a political lens that is not of my own making, but was kind of coercively enforced on me, that tells me that certain bodies are desirable or normative, that might be getting in the way of possibilities contained within my desire. So I think those are two very different projects. And often when we talk about critical interrogation of desire, I think people only have in mind the first sort of project, which certain feminists in the 60s and 70s were interested in undertaking, right? So they were interested in forms of separatism from men, also sometimes political lesbianism. So the embrace of lesbianism, not just as a kind of sexual orientation, but an actual political practice. But even that's sort of complicated because one thing that was happening in the women's liberation movement was just like women were just spending a lot of time with each other. And there was something, I think, genuinely erotically exciting for a lot of them. So even there, I think the distinction between disciplining your desire and kind of setting your desire free from politics is not a neat one.
This speaks to one of my favorite lines from the book, where you write in response to critics that you're not, quote, imagining a desire regulated by the demands of justice, but a desire set free from the binds of injustice. So do you want to say a little bit more on that distinction?
Rather than thinking of a project, rather than imagining kind of a feminist critique of desire as like this Maoist interrogation, which asks ourselves, or maybe
I just
even worse,
realized
asks
something.
everyone else around us, like, are you having sex with the right people? Are you desiring the right people? But rather opens us up imaginatively.
I just realized that two different audio things were coming off of my desktop. I don't know why.
Just the question of like,
I hope
what
that
kind of
doesn't
sex
mess
and
up
how might we want
how
to
people are
engage with
hearing
each
this.
other as sexual and embodied beings if like we hadn't been taught that only this form of sexuality is okay.
But so let me press on that project.
Yeah, so like I said the other day, like what I was talking about with, beauty standards and stuff, they always are changing. Like it makes no sense to me to get, the Kardashians' lips or this butt or those boobs or, this type of procedure because XYZ celebrity or influencer has that done. And that's what people are telling me the beauty standards are right now. But in like 10 years, or 5 years even, it's going to change drastically. Like in the 90s, especially late 90s, we had what was called heroin chic. Oops, I didn't realize my video wasn't up. The heroin chic look, which, let me show you. Nope, spelling things wrong. I don't think it's supposed to be heroin chic. Is it chic? I don't even know how to spell it, but this. So like, oh, I guess it is. That looks like heroin chick to me. Never mind. Okay. Some of these are not what I'm supposed to be, what I'm looking for. Uh, Here we go. Here's a fairly good example. Kate Moss was like one of the main, a lot of people, it's so weird seeing people with cigarettes. Here we go. Here's another Kate Moss. So like, oh, that would be funny. Oh, that's not very big. Okay. Oh, Tiffany Amber Thiessen. Hello. I'm really not finding exactly what I want, but I don't know if you remember what I'm even talking about. But basically, like super, super skinny. Like the people in the OC are like Misha Barton. So like back in the day, she was like incredibly skinny. But I mean, like I said, there's that, then there's like the Kardashians, beauty trends, like every country has different ones, beauty trends. Over the decades. Let's see what we got. There's like even makeup changes. You're a female who's always hated being one. Oh, so the volume was a bit lower. I can always like make it go up again. But like here's like just one example that is not even, plastic surgery or anything, but the makeup changes. So that's one beauty standard we got. Oh, and I love the 20s. I love like the little glam eye. I love that. Let's see. Even hair. So like your hairstyles will change over the decades. The clothes, obviously. I was looking for. That doesn't really show. Oh, good. No, those are the eyebrows. Okay. So you can even see how like eyebrow shapes change over the decades. And like in the 90s, they were super, super pencil thin. And now they're like, people are wanting to keep their natural bushy eyebrows as much as possible. I was hoping they'd have, like, plastic surgery wise, what was popular. Ah, plastic surgery trends. Oh, that's just showing, like, the trends are going up to how many people are getting plastic surgery these days. But, like, you can even see, like, it can really change your face, and honestly, not for the better occasionally. So, like, right now, this is the kind of plastic surgery style that is really popular. These, like, higher cheekbones, they want, like, buccal fat removal, which people never had that before the last, like, 5 years. I'm seeing if they had a thing on procedures. Hmm. I'm not seeing what exactly I'm looking for, but I mean, even the way that they do the procedures has changed and for the better. So people who have gotten plastic surgery, like when it was still being pioneered, probably look kind of messed up now. They didn't have much studies on how this stuff works in the body over time, and now we have more studies because plastic surgery has been going for enough decades now that we can have those stats.
For a minute. Because structured in that sentence, to free desire from the binds of injustice sounds like it would make it more just. But as I take that effort, if we set desire free from the binds of dominant cultures, which I think is the way you would operationalize what you're saying, it may not lead to desire moving in a more progressive way. I'll give some examples that I thought about as I was trying to imagine what that would look like. So you gave the example of racism as an oppressive way of shaping desire. At the same time, it is been a long and difficult project in human history to live well in diverse societies. There are powerful, seemingly pretty deep tendencies towards various kinds of segregation. And one story you could tell about human history is this laddering up of our ability to live with people who are more and more different from us, not our kin, not from the same place we are, not the same faith we are, etc. And so, set free, our desires might become narrower again. Or maybe from the right, you would get a critique like, there's a lot of cultural energy. This is a very common alt right view. There's a lot of cultural energy going into suppressing natural desires right now for aggressive alpha males. Or the traditionalist right view is we regulate male desire through monogamy, but free from constraint, men would be wildly promiscuous.
Hmm.
So when you talk about unbinding desire, do you worry it might just lead in weird ways?
Wait, I need to hear that again.
This laddering up of our ability to live with people who are more and more different from us, not our kin, not from the same place we are, not the same faith we are, etc. And so, set free, our desires might become narrower again. Or maybe from the right, you would get a critique like, there's a lot of cultural energy. This is a very common alt right view. There's a lot of cultural energy going into suppressing natural desires right now for aggressive alpha males. Or the traditionalist right view is we regulate male desire through monogamy, but free from constraint, men would be wildly promiscuous. So when you talk about unbinding desire, do you worry it might just lead in weird ways? That there's a lot of ways that we bind desire that are socially valuable or help with stability or actually are creating more just outcomes on some dimension than we might get otherwise?
Right. So I think I get off the boat of that argument. I'm not saying it's yours fairly early on. So what I want to reject is a picture on which there is this foundational human nature that's discovered by evolutionary psychology read through the lens of the alt-right, which says that we are all of necessity deeply aggressive acquisitive, boundary drawing, exclusionary creatures. And then we have to have forms of like civilization that temper those tendencies. I'm not saying there's like nothing to that story. I'm not saying that there is like we are some kind of evolutionary blank slate. And I also have a huge amount of time for psychoanalysis, right? So there are resonances here with a kind of Freudian picture on which civilization involves a necessary repression of certain kind of primordial instincts. But I think we are essentially social and historical creatures. And I think a lot of those stories that are told in kind of right-wing political circles are often, to be frank, kind of self-reports about fairly historically and culturally contingent experiences that people are having right now and then as a result of, I think, a fairly like messed up political culture, including some very real things like economic class division. So the picture I have is not one of just like letting bare human nature, whatever that is, just run loose. I don't even know what that means. I don't know what that would look like. We are, to use a kind of post-structuralist cliche, well, I'm like, we're always already in a kind of cultured place. So I don't think that that kind of flight from culture, that flight from politics is possible. So I think maybe more modestly, the way of reading me is to think about what would a kind of creative and imaginative engagement with our sexual realities as shaped by politics look like. And of course, I think that's going to involve in part thinking about substantive political values, like thinking about things like equality and respect. But I also think it's going to be about thinking about sort of more ineffable kind of quasi-mystical thoughts, like confronting the other in their wholeness and their radical like alterity and infinity, right? Like I think that's an important part of a certain form of sexual and romantic encounter, right? But also not just sexual and romantic. I think it's also part of, you know, what happens in good cases of family relations and friend relations, right? There's this thing where you realize that the other is just not an object in the world, but like you, this kind of locus of possibility and infinity.
All right. So that's as far as she wanted me to go. I don't know what to make of that. I feel like there were a lot of words and I was having a hard time processing them, which makes me really frustrated. I will definitely have to look through this transcript again and see what I can pull out of it for my assignment. Okay, because this part, okay, and it wasn't really about thinking creatively about the role that sex and desire and sexual hierarchy plays in human and social and political life. Okay. Okay, let me read this whole paragraph. But nonetheless, the women of both the US and the British women's liberation movement of the late 1960s and 1970s felt in an important sense that they were still having sex on men's terms. And in fact, sexual freedom had become synonymous with having lots of sex. Having lots of sex with lots of different partners, getting over your prudish hang-ups about having sex, and it wasn't really about thinking creatively about the role that sex and desire and sexual hierarchy plays in human and social and political life. Okay. What does freer sex look like? It's not a sex that operates as a kind of commodity that people hoard or kind of luxury status good that people hoard in order to climb a perceived sexual hierarchy. It's going to be a sex that isn't inflected by things like racism, classism, and ableism. Yes, okay. I get that. All right. What is next?
Welcome back to Women. We've spent a lot of time this quarter discussing gender identity as fluid rather than fixed. In this module, we'll consider the ways attraction and desire might be fluid as well. How are the things, activities, and people we're drawn to a product of our gender identity? And how do social systems of power like heteropatriarchy construct both who we are and what we want? Writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, the Greek philosopher Plato devoted several written dialogues to exploring the concept of eros. Plato understood eros in broad terms, including in its domain all forms of passionate desire that animate human beings toward beauty, truth, and harmony. In Plato's writings, humans emerge as desiring, aspiring creatures in constant pursuit of the objects of our desire. Plato's concept of eros often gets confused with contemporary notions of sex and sexuality. The English word erotic, for example, refers to something that's sexually arousing or exciting. While there are certainly overlaps between eros and sex, eros is a broader term that captures a larger field of human desire, extending beyond the pleasure we derive from our genitalia to include other sensory and intellectual forms of stimulation. During the 20th century, the American biologist Alfred Kinsey set out to understand the relationship between gender and desire. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, after conducting interviews with thousands of men and women, Kinsey published his groundbreaking studies of human sexuality. His studies concluded that approximately 10% of the adult population is predominantly or exclusively homosexual, which was the word that was common for same-gender sexual or romantic attraction. Today, the term homosexual is seen as dehumanizing and offensive because of its clinical history and use in targeting gay people as psychologically or morally disordered. These ideas about gay people have been discredited by the LGBTQ+ rights movement, as well as the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association. Preferred terms are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and LGBTQ+. Kinsey's books challenged the ideals of heteronormativity and monogamy that had long framed the way Americans understood desire and attraction. Sexual behavior in the human male became a bestseller, and readers around the world learned that among the thousands of male subjects Kinsey studied, 46% reported they'd had a sexual reaction to both men and women in their adult lives. In 1953, Kinsey published Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. The book revealed that 1 in 4 wives committed adultery at some point, compared with about half of all husbands, and that half of all women had sexual relations before marriage. Contemporary researchers have criticized Kinsey's methods and conclusions, questioning whether the subjects of his study were truly representative of the population at large. Still, Kinsey remains widely regarded as a pioneer in research on human sexuality and desire. In both books, Kinsey introduced his sexuality scale to capture how adults express and experience sexual desire. Writing about the
I
scale,
remember
Kinsey said,
reading about this.
males do not represent two discrete populations,
Think
heterosexual and homosexual. The world is not to be divided.
I think I learned about this in developmental psychology.
That nature rarely deals with discrete
and child
categories.
development.
The living world is a continuum in each and every one of its aspects. The Kinsey scale remained a popular way for the public to discuss sexuality for much of the 20th century. The scale conceptualized sexual desire as existing on a spectrum, but it treated gender as more fixed, reinforcing the binary categories of man and woman as both the subjects and objects of sexual desire. Nonetheless, Kinsey's studies were significant in reducing stigma around same-gender attraction and sexual activity. The studies gained visibility along with the rise of second-wave feminism, the widespread availability of birth control, and grassroots activism among people of color and LGBTQ+ people. Burgeoning social movements and technological developments accompanied new scientific
That picture
discourses
is
about
funny.
gender and sexuality, paving the way for the sexual revolution. The 1960s and 1970s were a transformative time in the US and Western Europe, as more people experimented with sex outside the bounds of heteronormativity,
Hello,
monogamy,
Indigo.
and procreation.
Welcome in.
The
Nice to
sexual
see
revolution
you.
wasn't the first time monogamy
I'm turning
and
this down a little bit.
heteronormativity were challenged in Western culture. The ideal of free love was championed by important Enlightenment figures in the 18th century.
Free
Free love
love.
seeks to separate sexual and romantic desire and expression from social and political regulation, such as regulation by governments, religions, and institutions, such as private property, marriage, and child rearing. Both the English poet William Blake and the English writer and feminist Mary Wollstonecraft criticized marriage as a form of social control that suppresses sexual desire and thwarts the human spirit. By the late 19th century, the free love movement had spread throughout the United States, as well as in Europe and Australia, with links to socialist, feminist, anarchist, abolitionist, utopian, and bohemian circles. Alexandra Kollontai, the Russian revolutionary and Marxist
No, it's a
social
cat.
theorist whose work we studied in
Kitty cat.
Module 5,
But kind of
also
looks fat,
advocated for free love,
which
by
I don't
which
mind.
she meant sexual and romantic relationships liberated from bourgeois possessiveness and the institution of private property. Each of the three texts I've assigned in this module helps us think more critically about the relationship between gender and desire, challenging us to consider sexual and romantic attraction and activity beyond the framework of heteropatriarchy. The first text I've assigned is a short essay called The Politics of Passion by Jackie Brown. Brown is a disability and queer rights activist, writer, and public speaker from
Oh,
Australia.
cool. Never
In the
heard of this
essay,
person.
Brown uses the word passion to describe what it's like to passionately kiss their girlfriend in public while sitting in their wheelchair. Pashing is a slang word used in Australia and New Zealand to refer to the act of passionate kissing. Brown describes how pashing allows them to resist stereotypes about both queer people and people with disabilities. I play with the fact that I'm eye-catching, they write. I dress up for it. It's part of why I dye my hair so red, why I wear my rainbow neckerchief, leather jacket, and Doc Martens, why I overlaid this body, this delightfully different body, with signals of queer sexuality. I like to trouble the assumption that people with disabilities are asexual. Brown portrays pashing with their girlfriend in public as an act of performance art.
But why? I am like weirdly, I'm not against PDA, but I don't like PDA very much. I feel like I'm intruding when someone is doing PDA, and I don't really like doing PDA myself. I don't know. Feels weird. Maybe it's just me. I'm the anxious one.
Through it, they communicate their sense of belonging, claiming their intersecting identities as both a queer person and a person with a disability. Pashing is a political act for Brown because it challenges ableism. Ableism refers to a set of beliefs and practices that devalue and discriminate against people with disabilities and people who are perceived to have disabilities. Ableism is pervasive in both US and global culture, and is rooted in the assumption that disabled people need to be somehow fixed or made better. Ableism is closely linked to biases that shape biology as a field of scientific study, in addition to the practices of medicine, public health, and mental health. These biases include anti-fat bias as well and produce socially constructed norms about what makes a healthy, whole, and virtuous body. There's also a tendency within ableist culture to treat people with disabilities as genderless. Consider how restrooms have traditionally been segregated in our culture. For a long
Yep,
time, US
that
society
is
has
true.
separated restrooms.
Also, I don't like waiting for the disabled spot when some people are probably not disabled using that spot in the bathroom. But, we can't really say anything, and I don't want to assume, but I feel like if you don't have equipment, maybe you don't need it, but I don't know. Some people are also claustrophobic. I don't want to think that everybody is a jerk for doing things, taking space from like disabled people.
According to the gender binary, assigning one restroom for men and one for women. With the rise of disability rights activism in the 20th century and the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, more public places offered a separate restroom for people with disabilities. While this improved access, separating disabled people.
Also, I would employ you to watch Crip Camp if you have not watched it yet. I think it's still on Netflix. Crip Camp. It is so good. It shows the people who basically who did start the 1990s Disabilities Rights Act.
People from male and female identified people reinforces the idea that disabled bodies have no gender. The idea that disabled bodies are genderless is connected to the idea that disabled bodies also lack sexuality. Ableist culture constructs people with disabilities as lacking not only sexual desire, but agency. Disability is treated as an essential or fixed obstacle that prevents people with disabilities from being able to make choices and have liberating experiences, erasing them from the arena of sexuality and desire. Jack's Jackie Brown actively resist this idea in their essay. They show us how they're living their life according to their own desires and direction. The second text I've assigned is an op-ed called Sexual Attraction and Fluidity by Charles Blow. Blow is a columnist for the New York Times who identifies as a bisexual man. In the op-ed, Blow explains the specific struggle bisexual people face in US culture. He writes, as much progress as has been made in the acceptance of LGBT-identified people in society, there is still a surprising level of resistance to people who identify as the B in that list of letters.
Especially bisexual men.
Or pansexual or omnisexual or even asexual.
It's like
And
they
that
expect
resistance
women
comes
to
from
be
straight and
bisexual,
gay
but not
people
men.
alike.
They're like, oh, that's gay. You're gay.
Pansexual and omnisexual are
So
both
dumb.
terms that describe the experience of being sexually or romantically attracted to people of many different genders. Asexual is a term that describes the absence of experiencing sexual attraction to others or a low interest in sexual activity. Our culture has a hard time letting go of binary thinking when it comes to both gender and desire. The norms of heteropatriarchy erase people who experience desire differently, such as those who are bisexual, asexual, omnisexual, and pansexual, as well as people whose relationships don't fit the norms of monogamy. Polyamory is a practice of engaging in multiple romantic and typically sexual relationships with the consent of all the people involved. About 4 to 5% of adults living in the United States
You hear that? Consensual, ethical non-monogamy is not where you dictate to your harem that they cannot have other partners, but you can. It is not holding people hostage in a marriage so that you can just go have other people. I'm not even saying this to anybody specifically, I'm just saying it in general. There's a lot of misconceptions out there and a lot of like hate on polyamory and polyamorous people. And I don't like when people do use it as a way to hurt people or use it in a way that hurts people. That is not fair. That is not okay. It's not cool. Don't do it. Don't be a dick.
Are currently in polyamorous relationships. As Blow writes, different people can experience attraction differently. For some, the order of attraction starts with body first. That's fine. For others, though, it starts with the being first, the human being.
That's kind of how I am.
Regardless of the body and its gender. That's also fine. And yet, the idea that one can have a physiological response to something other than gendered physicality seems to some antithetical to their rigid, superannuated notions of attraction, or even heretical to it. The final text I've assigned in Module 8 is the first 22 minutes of an episode of the Ezra Klein Show podcast. Ezra Klein, the host of the podcast, is a journalist and columnist for the New York Times. In the episode called Can We Change Our Sexual Desires? Should We? Klein interviews philosopher Amya Srinivasan about sex and desire and how they're informed by social systems of power and status. Srinivasan recently published a book of essays called The Right to Sex, Feminism in the 21st Century. The book grapples with contemporary issues of gender, power, and desire, such as consent, pornography, and dating apps. In the podcast you'll listen to, Srinivasan argues that desire attaches to ideals of beauty and attractiveness that are socially constructed by capitalism, racism, and heteropatriarchy. While we often think of desire as an authentic expression of who we are, Srinivasan encourages us to critically interrogate our desire, to ask the question, to what extent am I really in touch with what I desire? And to what extent am I really just interpreting my relations to other people through a political lens that is not of my own making, but was coercively enforced on me? That tells me that certain bodies are desirable or normative, that might be getting in the way of possibilities contained within my desire.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
When we liberate ourselves from ideals of beauty and attractiveness generated by coercive systems of power, we create new possibilities of desire. We allow ourselves to experience different and potentially more satisfying forms of attraction and relationships, and to give and receive consent more meaningfully. That's it for the first and only lecture in Module 8, The Gender of Desire. Thanks for your attention.
Woo! And I am going to end the stream for now, and I have other things that I need to do tonight. And I might come back on either later tonight or I'll do it tomorrow or this weekend sometime and read these. The Jackie Brown, The Politics of Pashing, and Charles Blow, Sexual Attraction and Fluidity. Only because they're both only 3 pages, so that will be easy to get through. All right, guys, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you. Thank you, and I will see you next time. Bye. Oh, before I go, important. Shh, come here. Listen to me. Come closer.